Welcome back, Geico Outkick Studios. I teased it right before. We had an amazing conversation with Bob Costas, legendary sports broadcaster, as a part of our Wins and Losses podcast. Went almost 2 hours. Encourage you to go download, subscribe to the Wins and Losses podcast. There are now 36 different long-form interviews that have been completed, and I think you'll really enjoy many of them. But I wanted to play you one of the excerpts from that conversation, and you're about to hear it now. It's me, it's Bob Costas, it's the Wins and Losses podcast. Here is what it sounded like. There are a lot of people out there right now who have experienced many of your broadcasts over the years. There are also a lot of young people who listen to this podcast because one of the goals with the Wins and Losses theme is to discuss the best and worst parts potentially of one's career and the wins and losses along the way. So I want to start here. Take you back to when you are in college. If you are able to go back and tell 20-year-old Bob Costas things that you have learned along the way in your career that you think would have been very important, there are 20-year-olds who would like to be the next Bob Costas listening to this podcast right now. What do you think you have learned that you didn't know when you were a college kid or maybe a high school kid trying to become what you became?
I think I learned this along the way, and it didn't take all that long. No matter how much you admire someone, you can be influenced by them. I was influenced by Jim McKay. I was influenced directly by Marty Glickman and Marv Albert. I went to Syracuse because they had gone to Syracuse, because Syracuse had early on, 50 years ago, they had a genuine communications department, not just a print journalism department, but a true state-of-the-art communications department. Now almost every university does, but Syracuse was ahead of the curve. And since I got there, a legion of notable sports broadcasters have followed, and some had preceded me, Marv and Marty and Dick Stockton and Len Berman and a few others, but now it's into dozens and dozens. But no matter who you were influenced by, Jim McKay, Vin Scully, Jack Buck, early in my career, I was in St. Louis at KMOX. One of the things I learned was do not copy them. They're great because they are distinctive, because they are not generic. And if you try to copy them, you'll only be a pale imitation of the master. Early on, it's inevitable that you'll copy somebody. You got to have a starting point. But eventually, you got to be able to develop your own style. Otherwise, you won't get very far. And the other thing I learned early on was that there's no such thing as a perfect broadcast. And that even, I think Vin Scully would tell you the same thing, as close to perfection as you could get. Maybe you have perfect moments. Jim McKay was perfect in that moment in Munich in 1972. Al Michaels was perfect with Do You Believe in Miracles? But if you are a perfectionist, that can be a good thing because it keeps you working hard and it makes you concentrate on the fine points and never be satisfied. But it can also cost you sleep unless you get a handle on it, because I used to fret over things that other people thought were terrific. Some of the things that people mentioned to me as among their favorite things I've ever done, somewhere in the back of my head is, yeah, but if only I'd said that, or if only I'd changed one word, or if only I'd remembered to include that. And eventually I came to understand, for my own peace of mind, that sometimes perfect is the enemy of the good. A lot of what I've done has been pretty damn good. Only occasionally do you reach perfection.
Did you go back early in your career and study your broadcast, listen to yourself to pick out flaws? Or
yes.
And how would you do that and be effective in being able to analyze yourself?
Well, then, in the 70s, you're listening to radio broadcasts on a cassette recorder. You couldn't get your television broadcasts unless you went down to 30 Rock at NBC and somebody there, queued it up for you. I bought one of the very early VHS machines, 3/4-inch tapes, an hour at a time. So a whole ball game was 3 tapes. I remember the Sandberg game in 1984, the legendary Cardinal-Cub game where Sandberg hit the 2 home runs off Bruce Sutter late in the game, and it was the NBC game of the week on a Saturday afternoon. When that meant something, it was a really big deal. Sometimes the Saturday afternoon game of the week got higher ratings, regular season game, than some World Series games. get now, and it's probably the signature game of Sandberg's career. It took 5 tapes to have that, and I've got those VHS tapes somewhere. But it was much harder then than it is now. Now everything's at your fingertips, and you can review it. I used to go back, and I remember being discouraged early on. The first time I heard myself on the air at WAER, the campus station at Syracuse, and I heard it back, and there were still vestiges of a New York accent, and it was a thin, reedy, kind of tinny voice. And then shortly after that, I heard the 26-year-old Al Michaels, just a year or two after that, on the radio on the 1972 World Series between the Reds and the A's. And I said to myself, damn, he's only 26. I'll never be that good. At least not in the next few years. I'll never be that good. And I was discouraged, actually, but things turned out all right, I guess, in the long run.
So that's amazing. Take me through your career path as a young guy. You're at Syracuse. How do you get in? Because you got to the top at NBC at a relatively young age. How did you get along that path? What happened to allow you to advance the way that you did, and where did you start?
Very importantly, I had a professor at Syracuse who took an active interest in me. He would identify a handful of kids each year who he thought had the potential to be good if they worked at it. And he was a caring but merciless critic to the point where, and no joke here, Clay, until the mid-'80s, when I was on NBC and pretty successful, I would still hear from him after a baseball or football broadcast. That was good, but, he was still critiquing me. And he helped me with projecting, with getting my voice into better shape. I never took speech classes, but he kind of gave me some tips. And he told me, you're rushing too much here. Pace is important. Try to pace yourself. Don't feel like you have to use all your preparation early on. It's normal to be anxious when you're young. So you come in really well prepared. But if you empty the whole bucket in the first few innings or in the first period of a hockey game or whatever it is, wait for the time where it really fits. And the audience doesn't know whether you've used 20% or 100% of what you came into the booth with, as long as what you used was appropriate and it was good. So I think that with his help and being at WAER, which is a legendary campus radio station, and you're surrounded by like-minded people, some of whom are really quite talented, and we fed off each other's energy, I think I became pretty good early. I must have had some precocious level of talent, and I worked to refine it. And then when I was a senior at Syracuse, I got a job broadcasting minor league hockey in the old Eastern Hockey League, the league that the Paul Newman movie Slapshot is based on. $30 a game, $5 a day, meal money on the road. But that was sort of a baptismal. I wasn't that good at it right away, but I became pretty good at it by mid-season. And I thought that I'd come back for a second season of that and finish up the remaining credits at Syracuse when I sent a tape to KMOX in St. Louis on a lark. The Carolina Cougars of the old ABA had become the Spirits of St. Louis. They would last for only 2 years until the ABA folded, and only 4 of the teams, the Nets, the Spurs, the Nuggets, and the Pacers, got absorbed, and the Spirits went away. But those 2 years were big for me. Somehow, some way, Jack Buck, who was the sports director of the station, they had some 200 applicants on reel-to-reel tapes, and Jack Buck liked my tape. And I got brought into St. Louis for an interview, and perhaps my willingness to work cheap. $11,000 was my salary for that first year at KMOX, and I would have paid them $11,000 if I had it. And so I'm at KMOX. I'm 22 years old, and I'm not a colleague of, I wouldn't be so presumptuous, but I'm in the same place as Jack Buck and Dan Kelly, who until Doc Emmerich came along was the gold standard of hockey announcers. And everyone was terrific there, both in news and in sports. They could have stocked a network with the quality of the talent that was there. And you got to kind of pick up your game if you're going to keep pace. And I think that accelerated my development as well. And I'll try to make this as concise as possible, but I've already failed in that regard.
People love these stories. Don't worry about that.
KMOX was not just an affiliate, it was a CBS owned and operated station when that really made a difference. 50,000 watt powerhouse station. And many of their announcers, Joe Garagiola, Harry Carey, Jack Buck, later Gary Bender and Dan Deerdorf, and of course later Joe Buck and Dan Kelly on hockey, these guys had gone to the network while remaining at KMOX. So it was kind of a feeder system. So Al Michaels is at CBS. It's September of 1976, and he signs with ABC less than a week before the first game of the season. And he was supposed to do San Francisco at Green Bay. And so the president of CBS Sports calls Bob Hyland, who ran KMOX, and says, we need somebody. Well, Buck already had an assignment. Kelly had an assignment. He said, we got a kid here. He's 24 years old. He looks like he's 14, but he's pretty good. Off I go to Green Bay. I had never done, except for a half of 2 football games on the radio, I'd never done a football game. I go to Green Bay. Jay Randolph showed me how to make a spotting board. I go to Green Bay. I do this game. I'm sure it wasn't a game worthy of the time capsule, but it was good enough that they brought me back for occasional games, maybe 3 or 4 small regional games a year in football or backup basketball games on the NBA. And Don Ohlmeyer at NBC, even though none of those games ever went to the big market of New York, he became aware of me, and he hired me when I was 27 full-time at NBC. And after I was there for only a month or so, he calls me into his office and he says, we really like your work. We think you have a future here. Let me ask you something. How old are you? I said, I'm 27. He said, God damn it. You look like you're 14. Exact words. He goes, how much older do you think you would look if you grew a beard? And I said, 5 years at least. And he perks up. He goes, really? I said, yeah, because that's how long it would take to grow it. So, somehow it worked out. Even when I was hosting the Olympics when I was 40, I'm sure I didn't look the part exactly, but people accepted it, and it worked out. And I think the bottom line of it is, if you have any talent at all and you get thrust into situations, Brian Gumbel left sports to go to the Today Show. They didn't have anybody in mind to host the football show, and that eventually became hosting the NBA on NBC and hosting the Olympics. I got thrust into it. I had almost no studio hosting experience at all. The first 5 years, I never used a teleprompter at all. I just ad-libbed everything. But I just found my way, and you become more and more comfortable with it. Think of the luck involved. NBC hires Vin Scully. Joe Garagiola and Tony Kubek had been a legendary pair. They put Joe with Vin. Vin has to be on the A game. He's the greatest. I inherit Tony Kubek. The backup game becomes a much more important thing. And then I started hosting the World Series. And in the years where we had both LCSs, Tony and I would do the American League. That put me on a much bigger stage than I would have expected at that point in my career. Now, if an opportunity comes along, you have to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. David Letterman starts his show in 1982 at NBC. One night, he wants a sportscaster to do mock commentary on elevator races. Marv Albert is the guy he wants. Marv is out of town doing a Knick game. I'm sitting in the office. They go, we got this kid here, Bob Costas. Send him up. I get on the elevator. I'm on the 6th floor. I do this thing for David Letterman. He likes it because I kind of get where he's coming from and what he wants, this mock serious thing. He brings me back to sit down next to him at the end of the show. I say something that makes him laugh. He says, you're really funny. Would you like to do this again? I said, of course I would. You're David Letterman. Even then, he's David Letterman. I was probably on 24 times. And those things not only introduced me to a different audience in a different way, but early on when you're trying to find your way, you get some laughs there or you get some good notices for what you're doing in the sportscasting world. It increases your confidence, and it makes you feel like you can be more spontaneous and show more of yourself, not just color between the lines, but maybe color outside the lines a little bit.
Those are all amazing, and I want to unpack a little bit of that. We're talking to Bob Costas. I'm Clay Travis. We're here with the Wins and Losses podcast. How nervous were you going to Green Bay to call that game at 24 years old?
Shaking like a freaking leaf. And the analyst on the game was someone that only older listeners would remember firsthand. Hall of Fame receiver Tommy McDonald, who had been a big deal at Oklahoma and then primarily with the Philadelphia Eagles, one of the last to play without forget about a mask, no bar on.
Yeah,
on
that's
the
amazing.
Helmet.
Yes.
And then went to the single helmet thing. And he was quite a single bar. And he was quite a character. But however nervous I was, he was 100 times more nervous. He has since passed away, and I say this with affection. Clay, he literally froze. On the on-camera open, he couldn't remember what he wanted to say. And I'm 24 years old. Nobody outside St. Louis has any damn idea who I am. And so I'm doing the whole broadcast by myself. There were times when he couldn't complete sentences. And that was the last game he ever did. So I was nervous to begin with, and I was damn near panic-stricken by the second quarter, but I muddled through, and they brought me back. So either I was very lucky or I was a little bit better than I feared.
Okay, other question. Don Ohlmeyer, I know that he was incredibly important for a lot of different people in the world of sports. What did he mean for you and for people who do not know him? Who was he and why was he important?
Don Ohlmeyer was bigger than life. He and Dick Ebersol, who was even more important in my career, were protégés of Roone Arledge. Roone Arledge is, of course, still viewed as the single most important person in the history of sports television who wasn't on the air, although I think Dick Ebersol could rival him for that. So first Don and then Dick headed up NBC Sports, and they each had a tremendous influence on me. And the very fact that they liked me and saw something in me that maybe others would not have seen, at least that quickly, that elevated my career. They put me in positions to succeed, or I guess fail, and luckily each of those worked out. In the case of Dick Ebersol, not only did he elevate me from late-night host of the Olympics to primetime host. I'd been the late-night host in 88. He made me the primetime host in 92 in Barcelona. But he also created a late-night talk show for me in conjunction with Brandon Tartikoff. Later with Bob Costas, followed Johnny Carson and David Letterman in NBC's late-night lineup and showed a different side of me because only maybe 5% of it had to do with sports. Most of it was other walks of life. So Ohlmeyer at the beginning, hiring me, having some confidence in me, giving me big assignments. I mean, in the first year I was there, when Dick Enberg had an overlap and there was a college basketball game and a football game, he'd go to do the football game, and Ohlmeyer threw me right in there with Al McGuire and Billy Packer, a legendary combination in college basketball, back when a college basketball game on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon was a different thing than it is now. The media landscape was so different. So Don threw me into those things, and basically it was sink or swim, and I might have sunk a few times, but I made it to the other side of the waterway, I guess, to strain that metaphor. And then when Don went off and eventually became the head of entertainment at NBC in the 90s, in the heyday of NBC, ER, Seinfeld, Cosby Show, whatever, Friends, whatever it might have been, when NBC was the unquestioned number one, Ebersol is running NBC Sports, and NBC Sports is clearly number one in that area, and Ohlmeyer's running NBC Entertainment, and luckily, I'm their boy. I mean, I'm sure that I aggravated them. I know I aggravated them sometimes because sometimes I have a mind of my own, so I may have pissed them off now and then, but what they did for me is something I can never fully repay. And they were both so charismatic and dynamic. They themselves were as big a star, at least among those who knew them, as any of the broadcasters were. They had tremendous presence. When they walked into a room, you knew that you better snap to it and pay attention because there was just something about them. Something, intelligence is one thing, insight is another, but presence and charisma, and they had it in spades.
You mentioned going on David Letterman. So as a
Yep.
kid growing up in Nashville, I would watch baseball all day long, right? When I was home in the summers in particular, I'd watch WGN with Harry Carey and Steve Stone in the afternoons. I would watch the late night at the time ESPN games. And one of the great things about being a kid and being able to stay up late, and I've always kind of been a night owl despite the fact that I have an early morning show, is I would watch David Letterman. And I just found him to be an unbelievably compelling television presence who, as you mentioned earlier, broke pretty much every rule that would have existed in television, right? If you had gone through and said, how would you design a late night show? They came up with basically everything that they would tell you not to do, and it worked flawlessly for Letterman. What was working with him like? You said you went on his show a bunch as well, and you've later followed his show. What did you find him to be like off the air as opposed to on the air, and how would the show be constructed, and what, if anything, could you take from that?
Well, David didn't want anything to be cookie cutter. You go on other shows, they do a pre-interview, and you talk about a few areas that you might discuss, and you give them a few anecdotes that you have that are sure to get laughs and be interesting. And David would have that, but he'd depart from it. Jay Leno would pretty much stay with it, and Jay was successful for his own reasons. But Letterman thought there was an integrity in that. At least that was my assumption, that if he just painted by the numbers, that he couldn't be David Letterman. So you never knew. He could get bored with what you were saying, or he could want to challenge you. He could throw something out. So you really had to be on your toes when you were on with David Letterman. But David was great to me. He was always very kind to me, said nice things about me. And when he went to CBS, after he didn't get the Tonight Show and Jay Leno did, part of his deal was that he controlled the hour after his show. And eventually Tom Snyder got that hour, and later Craig Kilborn and Craig Ferguson, but Snyder was the first one. But only after David offered it to me.
Oh, wow.
And I was very tempted because it was David Letterman and because it was a full hour, and it was an hour earlier, 12:30 instead of 1:30. But NBC had the NBA. They still had the NFL, although I was transitioning out of the NFL, but still they had it. They were reacquiring baseball. I was the host of the Olympics. And so if the offer had come at a different time, I certainly would have taken it, and I certainly appreciated that David thought enough of me to offer it to me.
That's a really fascinating story from Bob Costas about potentially what his career might have been if he had gone and taken the spot right after David Letterman as opposed to sticking to the world of sports. That entire conversation, by the way, really, really interesting. Trust me, if you enjoyed it, we now have 36. That's 36 long-form conversations that we have done as a part of the Wins and Losses podcast. And there is a lot of great content out there. Bob Costas was phenomenal. Appreciate the time that he gave us on Friday, and wanted to play that for you on the program as well.